Theodora Boneva with us, and she is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University College London, and her current research focuses on the evolution of preferences and skills and the role of beliefs in educational investments. And today she's going to talk a little bit about comparing some of the survey-based measures and incentivized experimental measures that we've heard about.
Thanks for the introduction. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about a couple of advantages and disadvantages of survey-based measures versus incentivized experimental measures, and also talk about some validation of survey methods that we've seen in the session today, but also some other ones that exist. So we've kind of talked about some of these things already during the last day of the conference. But I mean, something that's really nice about incentivized experimental measures is that we can observe concrete choices in a controlled environment. So we know what kind of uncertainty people face because we are designing the environment in a specific way, and we can see how the choices, what kind of choices that people make in these environments. Whereas with surveys, I mean, there are many problems, right? We don't really know how subjects interpret the specific questions. And I think there are a couple of different problems here. So, for example, one of them is that we have no information about the environment that subjects face, but also how they perceive their environment to be. Even if two people are in the same environment, they can have very different perceptions of the environment that they are facing. And that could potentially affect their answers in these surveys. We've also already talked about reference points and norms. So I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but just to give some examples. So for example, let's take the question, how willing are you to take risks in the context of car driving? So even if you take, I don't know, a couple of people who have exactly the same car driving behavior, presumably they're going to give you very different answers depending on whether they live in the Netherlands or in India. Or, I don't know, something like, I see myself as someone who's curious about many different things. I mean, what does this even mean, many different things? I don't know. Grit, I'm a big fan of Grit. Where's Angela? No, okay. I've been obsessed with a certain idea or project for a short time, but later lost interest. Okay, I mean, I was trying to determine whether I'm gritty by trying to answer this questionnaire. I really didn't know what to say because, okay, so I've just pursued a PhD. It was over a long period. I finished it, so maybe I score high on this. But then I thought, oh, there were so many projects I started that never really went anywhere. So maybe I score really low. I don't know. I really don't know what this means. So it's very hard, I find, to kind of conceptualize what we're actually measuring using these survey techniques. So of course, experimental measures, even if we think they're the gold standard, well, they're obviously very expensive if you want to pay everybody and you have 80,000 people you want to collect information on. I don't know who's going to finance this. They're difficult to administer. It takes a lot of time. You have to administer payments, especially with interactive games. I mean, it's very difficult to actually do this in the field. So, surveys have some obvious advantages, and it's interesting to think about how we can use one or the other or complement the two. Okay, another potential concern is faking. I mean, these kinds of things were already brought up yesterday. There might be issues with impression management or self-deception. One thing that I think we need more research on, which I wasn't really able to find very much on, is how do these different things interact with things like personal characteristics or the context of the survey. So could it be the case that somebody who's more neurotic is more concerned about self-deception? I don't know. And how do we take this into account when we kind of interpret the results of surveys? Also, I mean, the context of the survey is also an obvious one. I mean, if I go to a job interview and somebody asks me, okay, to rate myself on these couple of items, I mean, it's very unlikely that I know that if I'm applying to a job at the University of Chicago, I'm going to say, yeah, I'm quite moody, I worry quite a lot, I'm somewhat careless, and I tend to be lazy. I mean, there's a big issue here, I think, in what context you're trying to measure what. And it's not entirely obvious how you take the context into account when you're trying to control or allow for this. So it might be somewhat less problematic with incentivized experiments because some real stakes are involved. But of course, even here you could have that issue, right? So if the person who's taking the incentivized experimental task is aware of what is at stake, otherwise he might be willing to forego the incentives in the task. But at least I think it's a way to the right direction. Okay, and the obvious one is availability. I mean, if you want to decide between which measure to use, it's kind of useful if you actually have two measures you can compare. So I think for economic preferences, we have some survey-based measures, and experiments do exist. We've seen some very nice examples today in the talk. So for time discounting, risk aversion, social preferences, we have very good measures, and yeah, we can think about which ones to choose. Also, what I would like to stress here, and this is something which came up yesterday as well, is that these things are not just important for economic decision making, but it also seems that these are malleable. And I think that this is really important. This is also why, these things should be measured, for example, in OECD surveys or other surveys. So just to say a couple of examples for each of these. So on time discounting, Schule has a very interesting project together with Seda AirTouch, where they show that an educational intervention has a significant impact on students' choices and incentivized time preference and recitation tasks. Also, with risk aversion, actually, jointly with Julia, I have a paper where we look at how the home environment affects risk preferences and how they evolve. Or on social preferences, Armin has a very interesting paper where he looks at the effects of a very successful German mentoring intervention and how that causally affects the evolution of social preferences in children. So there's stuff out there which really shows that these things are not just important but also malleable. So I think it's important to think about how we measure those. Okay, so I'm not going to go into detail, but yeah, there seems to be some different experiments, but also different questions, and you can think about how these relate in different ways. Okay, but what about personality measures? So we have the Big Five, we have curiosity grid. All of these seem to be very important, and there seem to be survey-based measures that exist. But I found it hard, at least, to find analogous incentivized experiments which would measure these. So if I were to decide if I wanted to use an experiment or a survey, well, it's kind of easy because we don't really have very good experiments for some of these things. So for the Big Five, I don't know if anybody knows something, let me know. I don't know if there are incentivized experiments doing this. For curiosity, I don't know, I'm not sure. Okay, so Shuli can tell us more. So I know there's some novel research going on about this. Have you written it up already? Okay, I don't know. On grid, there has been some new stuff. So Shuli and I have a paper together with Seda AirTouch on developing an incentivized measure of grid, in which we measure the choice of task difficulty, perseverance after negative feedback, goal setting, and skill accumulation. And actually, this whole thing is done in the context also of an educational intervention. So we randomize an educational intervention across schools, and then we see whether the children who were exposed to the treatment behave differently. And we find that the treatment that we tested made students more likely to take up challenging tasks, more likely to persevere after negative feedback, set more ambitious goals, and then also accumulate more skills as a result, and also get higher payoffs in our experiment. So again, there seems to be that it's not just important to think about, what is grid, what does it predict, but also is it malleable, how is it malleable, and so on. There's also some more recent work which use anagram tasks, and also that's also incentivized to kind of try to get some more experimental measures of grid. Another thing that I would like to point out, and that's something I've been missing a little bit from the discussion in the last 2 days, is the role of beliefs. So I'm not really sure if the belief is a skill, and I was supposed to talk about non-cognitive skills, but it seems to me that what matters also for the skill accumulation process is the beliefs about the productivity of effort or investments. So if you think that your effort or investments are not going to make a big difference in your skill accumulation process, then you're not going to exert very much effort. That's kind of linked also to your beliefs about the malleability of skills, or your beliefs about the malleability of personality as well. And I think to ignore this is kind of not such a great idea, because so let's say I realize that I'm not very well organized, but that I need this kind of skill to progress, to achieve some other goal that I want to achieve. Then if I have this skill to realize that I can actually improve this non-cognitive skill, that might help me a lot. And to ignore this is also like, if you just, when you go to the airport and fly back to respective countries where you came from, there's a huge industry, right, that sells books like The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, Being in Balance, 9 Principles of Creating Habits to Match Your Desires. Where did I find this? I just Googled, I went on Amazon and just Googled 10 best self-help books or something. I've not read any of this, so I'm not advertising them. Or like this one, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Over 25 million people have apparently read this book. So there seems to be demand for these kind of things. So I think we should think more carefully about who's buying these books and why are some people buying these books and others. So this is a particularly nice one. I don't know. Okay, so back to the more serious part. Validation of survey methods. So I really like the talk that Armin gave for a variety of different reasons. I think it's very nice that he took a long survey measure, whole battery of questions, and then asked, okay, I'm not just going to pick some at random and say, okay, we're going to ask these 8 questions, but we're going to think about which one of these questions are best at predicting behavior in the experimental task. I think that's a nice procedure and something worth exploring more. And I'm not going, well, he kind of said all of these things already, so he has 2 incentivized experiments for each preference, which reduces measurement error. The experiments in the surveys are conducted a week apart, which I think is also good. He plays around with the order to see what's happening, so it's really a lot of care went into designing this whole setup. Yeah, the questions that best predict behavior in experiments are typically a hypothetical version of the experiment itself, and a subjective assessment of the general orientation, so something like how willing are you to take risks in general, and so on. So something I'd like to point out, which I think is also interesting, is that so if you look at the predictive power of the surveys for the experimental measures, you get an R-squared of like maybe 0.15 to 0.47. And if you compare that to the test-retest correlation, if you just do the same experiment twice, these are the numbers that you get. So one way to look at this is that the surveys don't actually do that bad in comparison to the test-retest correlation, which is Armin's preferred explanation. Another way to look at this is that why is the test-retest correlation so low? So one thing I would like to see is if you did the surveys and you also did a test-retest correlation, would you get similar results? Maybe yes, maybe no, but it would just be interesting to know. But I mean 60.66 I think is not too bad of a number, so I think that's something we can start from. Okay, these are just like, Armin didn't present this, but this is from his paper. So this is the variance explained by the first question, for example, on trust for the experimental measure of trust. This is the way to read this graph. And you can see that it varies quite a lot. So for some you have like 40-50%, for others you only have 20%. And I think an important thing is to also think about why this might be the case. Because it might be that, yeah, you're measuring different things with the survey vis-a-vis the experimental measure, and I think to get a better understanding of what one is capturing versus the other is capturing, it's an interesting thing to explore more in the future. Okay, so Armin has been talking a lot about the virtues of representative samples and using many countries. The experimental validation itself was done in a non-representative sample only in one country, and of course I think given that this is a completely new area of research, I think it's a really good way forward to start somewhere. But of course we don't really know whether the structure of correlations between the experimental measures and the survey measures could differ across individuals with different characteristics or across cultural contexts. So only because these things correlate in this one sample, we don't know if the same is true for other countries or if we use different populations. And I was trying to get my head around what this would mean if this was not the case. But yeah, I think it's at least something we should be a little careful about and think a little bit more. Yeah, especially because of the issue we discussed in the beginning, that subjects with different heuristics and different environments might interpret questions differently. So there are also other studies that have done experimental validations of surveys. So just to name a few, for example, in Boneva Armin is also involved in this. He shows that in a representative sample of Germans, experimentally elicited risk attitudes correlate with the willingness to take risk in general. Same is true for time preferences or for trust. There's one paper here which has 3,000 subjects in 30 countries. So trouble is that per country they only have hundreds of subjects, and within each country it's also non-representative. But something I thought was interesting was, so the experimentally elicited risk and uncertainty attitudes correlate with the willingness to take risks, but the correlations differ immensely. So in some countries it's like positive as we would expect. Then there's a whole range between 0 and this number 0.42. But then also there are a couple of countries where it's like surprisingly negative. And you're like, okay, is this like an artifact of the small sample or what is going on here? So I don't know. I don't know what this means or how to interpret this, but I think it would be something worth thinking about more. So to sum up, basically, I think, I think we should think more carefully about designing incentivized experimental tasks, not just for the economic preferences, but also of non-cognitive skills or of personality measures. The development of experimentally validated surveys seems like an interesting way forward, and we need to get a better understanding of how survey-based measures and experimental measures correlate for people with different characteristics and for people in different cultures. And yeah, I mean, also to just, I don't know, I was trying to get my head around what measure is actually measuring what, and also what Armin kind of raised yesterday, also in the general discussion. What is a better measure? What does this even mean? Are we trying to get the highest predictive power, or what is the benchmark we're using when we're trying to compare measures against each other, or how can we effectively combine them? Yeah. So these were just some general thoughts on.
What about the other question of how these different measures are related? I mean, you were talking about beliefs. I was asking Angela, well, does mindset actually project onto somebody? We think that mindset might be important. And others have done. The question is, how does that relate to some of the other measures?
I completely agree. So in the project that I have with Julie, we actually looked at that a little bit because we were wondering whether the intervention changed behavior and incentivized tasks through changing people's beliefs about how much effort actually matters. So we used a survey, for example, to elicit people's beliefs about the malleability of skills, and that's exactly what we found. So we found that it seems to be that the degree to which somebody is gritty is related to what he believes how much grit or effort actually pays off, and that the intervention also shifted those beliefs in a way.
How much you also collected like the big five measures on the same data set?
No, we don't have to.
I'm just curious how much those would change. For example, in terms of trying to measure non-cognitive skills, going back to Koji's question at the beginning of the session yesterday, I mean, should we put that on the agenda in some sense for OECD? Larger question.
No, I think
I think that would be an effective, potentially very important distinction about what a good schooling system is doing, promoting this and that.
No, I agree.
So what other things shifted is a very, very good question, right? Because what we measure in our paper is, again, just a total derivative in a very, very targeted setting, but still, other things may have shifted.
Right.
We know this conversion didn't shift, we know the time reference didn't shift, we know curiosity and creativity didn't shift, but we don't know every other thing. We know malleability shifted, we know perseverance score shifted.
Perseverance, conscientiousness, then we had a separate measure.
Yeah, we have Angela's perseverance, the grid measure. We have that shifted. Yeah, so we have like type of beliefs, questions that shifted. Confidence didn't shift somehow.
But how much is the change in grit versus changing, for example, mindset?
So do you understand condition changes in those surveys?
So what are you asking? Whether to what extent?
Well, you have an experiment. You have multiple changes. The question is, why would you say is it operating primarily through changing grid? Are these just
No, but wait. I mean, okay. So
No,
I
it's the
suppose.
other way, right?
Yeah. So I suppose the mechanism which we have in mind is that the intervention might have shifted students' beliefs about how much perseverance or grit actually pays off, which is why it might be that they self-report higher on gritty behavior and also behave more gritty in the incentivized experimental tasks. So I wouldn't say either or. It's rather that this is
No, I
the challenge in which it
understand.
might
You have
be.
multiple ways of this, right? I mean, your problems do all the time. So the question is how that evolves the intervention proceeds.
Yeah, so I think the question of how this evolves in the long run and also if there are complementarities and things like that, and yeah, that's an important issue. We have one way for follow-up right now, but I think we're going to think about how to follow up this.
Right? You just know only baseline and 4 months after, but not yet.
I think there's a separate question about growth mindset and Ability 5, right? Which you could say is just a special case of relating beliefs to personality. And I don't think that's actually well explored because it's like two different tribes of psychology. Maybe I'll know better, but I don't think that there are a lot of people who are asking that question. Broadly speaking, though, I think 50 years of psychology would say that beliefs lead to behavior. Like that's what cognitive therapy is changing people's maladaptive beliefs to change their downstream behavior. So